With that, let's get ready to rumble. Bring in the dog and cat. It's too hot outside for them anyway. Pour yourself a big cup of joe, slide into those silky jammies and the bunny slippers, plop yourself down in the Barca Lounger, turn down the light, and turn up that radio. In a moment, the death of Jimmy Hoffa and the story of the guy who did it with my guest, Charles Brandt. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. You know, being a reporter in Las Vegas and covering mob stories for many years, it's kind of a natural thing that I would have an interest in Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, who doesn't? Hoffa's Teamsters Union pension fund built modern Las Vegas. Loans from that fund went into pretty much every hotel on the Strip in the 60s and early 70s. The casinos in those days couldn't get loans from regular banks. It just wasn't done. So along with these Teamster loans, the loans from the pension fund, strings were attached, and those strings involved mobsters. So mobsters would be put into these casinos, and then tens of millions of dollars were skimmed from those casinos and sent to mafia bosses all across the country. Jimmy Hoffa was a tough guy who learned how to sort of survive with a foot in both camps. 41 years ago this week, he had no idea that the clock was ticking, that he had only a few days to live. His disappearance, July 30th, 1975, set off a national furor and speculation that continues to this day about what happened to him. In my opinion, the issue was resolved for good once Charles Brandt came out with his book, I Heard You Paint Houses, with the story of Frank the Irishman Sheeran. A new updated version has just been released. You can judge for yourself as you hear the story unfold tonight. Welcome back to the program, author, former prosecutor, Charles Brandt. Charlie, great to have you here.
Great to hear your voice again, George. It's been too long.
Yeah, absolutely. The new version of this book, exciting stuff. I mean, especially the last part, things that you could not write, could not say before, because it would have put your life at risk. Am I exaggerating?
No, not even a little bit. The mafia, as Frank Sheeran taught me, has an expression, when in doubt, have no doubt. So if they have any doubts about you, you're gone.
Is there anyone left who might take offense to what you put out there?
No. And believe me, if there were anyone left who might take offense, I wouldn't put it out there.
Let's start with Hoffa. 41 years ago, we've got a picture that I found that was taken on this date, 41 years ago. He's got 6 days to live. He seems unguarded and relaxed and smiling in this photo. We're putting it on the website. What was he doing in this period of his life that made it all but certain that he would be killed? Sort of set the stage there.
Sure. In the photo, he was posing. He was at his lake cottage. He had a cottage in a lake in north of Detroit. And he was promoting himself to be the next president of the Teamsters. He had been the president of the Teamsters from 1957 until 1967, when he was put in jail through the efforts of the former Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. And he was sprung from jail by a pardon given to him by Richard Nixon when some cash changed hands. But in the pardon, there were restrictions on his running for office again. He couldn't run in the next election. And he fought those restrictions in court. And he campaigned like crazy to become the president again. The rank and file loved him. The people that weren't happy about his return were those mafia bosses that had more of an unlimited access to the Central States Pension Fund than they had when he was in charge of it. His replacement, a man named Frank Fitzsimmons, was scared to death of the mafia, and he gave them whatever they wanted. He gave them terms that Hoffa would never have given them on loans to build casinos. Everything Hoffa did with them was collateralized. Now, he did take some points under the table for his own use, but the Teamsters Pension Fund was protected by Hoffa. It was not protected by Fitzsimmons, and that enabled the mafia to make more money out of Fitzsimmons with some loans that were absolutely fraudulent. They would just pocket the millions in cash. And Hoffa was threatening to put an end to that when he took back the Teamsters. He was also expected to win his lawsuit. And it was really going to be a slam dunk. The president had the power to pardon Hoffa, but he had no power to put restrictions on what Hoffa did with his life once he was pardoned. So,
if you just look at the last part of his life, you could say he was a bad guy. He was in bed with the mob, and he was taking things under the table, and it was he deserved what he got coming. But looking at the earlier parts of his life, I mean, it really does seem like he was sincere about really being in the corner of the working man and turning his union into a force for good for workers, but sure didn't work out that way.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because it's true. It's also true of Frank Sheeran. The words "I heard you paint houses," spoken by Jimmy Hoffa to Frank Sheeran, that was a job interview. Frank was working for Russell Buffalino, the most powerful mob boss in America at the time, and he was doing hits for Russell Buffalino. Hoffa said to Russell, who was an ally of his at the time, "I need some muscle. I just became president." And Russell recommended The Irishman to him. They had a conversation over the phone, and Frank Sheeran then went to work for Hoffa. Frank was totally impressed with the work that Hoffa did for the working men and women of America, not just his own Teamsters, and the efforts he put in on their behalf. And so was the Mafia. I mean, they didn't run the Central States Pension Fund like they were going to once Hoffa went to jail. They cooperated with each other, but they respected Hoffa for that. And Sheeran became the same way. He worked very hard for the men in his local. He was head of the Teamsters local in Wilmington, Delaware, where I was practicing law. And they took that part of their life seriously. Now, at the same time, Frank Sheeran was a murderer. At the same time, Jimmy Hoffa ordered hits on what people he perceived to be standing in the way of the progress he wanted to make in the Union.
People who are too young to have been around at that time, maybe they've seen a documentary or something, seen references to Hoffa or read newspaper articles or something, but it's hard to express what a colossal figure he was in American life. I mean, he was all over the place. He was powerful and passionate.
In my book, I say that Americans at the time could identify Elvis Presley's voice instantly when they heard it on the radio or television, and the same was true of Jimmy Hoffa. Everybody could hear the sound of his voice giving one of his famous speeches, attacking big business, attacking those who he felt were taking advantage of the working men and women and not willing to pay the wages that he felt his people needed to receive.
Why was it necessary for Hoffa to cut a deal with the mob to open the door and let him in? What did he need from them?
Going back, it was a deal that was in place when he took over. He expanded it, and what it emanated from was that management were hiring Italian goons to break strikes. They would come in with billy clubs and break the strike, and the picketers would scatter. And they got the idea, the Teamsters especially got the idea of making an alliance with these mobsters that supplied the thugs. And that led to more and more involvement. You know, when you get involved with the Mafia, it doesn't take much, and you're theirs. And that's how Frank got involved with them. The book is actually a biography of Frank Sheeran, who led an incredible life. The main feature of his life, I would think, are the 411 combat days he spent in World War II in General Patton's Killer Division. Patton christened the division, the Thunderbird Division, my Killer Division, and you're not to take prisoners. The original crimes for war atrocities against American servicemen were against the Thunderbird Division right after the invasion of Sicily, where prisoners were killed. And Frank spent 411 days in combat when the average was 80, and when at 200 days you were eligible for a discharge. He had been a Huckleberry Finn kind of guy before the war. He came out of the war a changed man. And Frank was a strict Irish Catholic. His father studied for the priesthood for 5 years. His mother went to Mass every morning. And during the 5 years I had Frank, I had also been raised Catholic. I was able to work on that and bring that out of him. I'm a guy who taught interrogation to cops. I solved lots of crimes as a homicide investigator through interrogation. I taught cross-examination to other trial lawyers. In 1988, I wrote a book, The Right to Remain Silent, based on the and I was still practicing law at the time, based on the crimes that I had solved through interrogation. And Frank was in my domain for 5 years, the last 5 years of his life. And in that period, we talked a lot about his Catholic faith and about the hereafter and about his coming clean and making a clean breast of it before he died. And that was his aim at the end of his life. During his times with Hoffa, of course, you did what you were told. During his times with Russell Buffalino, you did what you told. As Frank said to me, if I ever said no to Russell, Jimmy would have been just as dead, and I'd have gone to Australia with him, meaning I'd have gone down under and been killed with him. And Frank got into this line of work with Russell Buffalino totally by accident. When he got out of the war, he said, we didn't have war syndrome in those days. You'd wake up in a bed wondering what you were doing in a bed, and your whole body would be sweating. He said that he never slept more than 4 hours a night after the war. And he just was on overload. He was overwhelmed by 411 combat days.
It sort of burned his brain, sort of erased his conscience, I guess, in a sense.
It truly did. Certainly the Catholic conscience that he had been raised with was in there somewhere, but it needed work to bring it out again. But he was in 3 amphibious invasions, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France, with lots of bullets being thrown at you as you wade ashore. And when he got out of the war, he began to work as a truck driver for Food Fair, an East Coast supermarket chain. And he wasn't really doing much of anything wrong. I mean, little stuff. He played football for the local Catholic football team, parish football team, and he got married. And initially he had 3 daughters. And one day he was at a truck stop outside of Elmira, New York, and his horse, what they call his truck, he couldn't get it started. And this older Italian man came over to him and said, "Let me give you a hand." And it was Russell Buffalino. I mean, a fascinating person. Russell was, in addition to the mafia boss that the CIA contacted when they decided they wanted to kill Castro, Buffalino was also a master mechanic. He fixed Sheeran's horse, got his rig started, and there was something about Frank Sheeran, 6'4", tough as nails, hard-edged, kind of a film noir character, post-war Frank Sheeran. And he invited Frank Sheeran to hang out a little bit at a bar in Philly and a restaurant in Philly, the Friendly Tavern. Sheeran began hanging out there. Then they began to give Sheeran little ways of making money.
Hold on there a second. Charles Brandt is my guest. We're talking about his book, I Heard You Paint Houses, about the man who befriended and later killed Jimmy Hoffa. The circumstances later on in Coast to Coast AM. That's from the album Blood on the Tracks, Bob Dylan, Tangled Up in Blue, from 1975. In fact, all the songs we're playing in this hour are from 1975, sort of put you in that era, the era when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. And if you've ever wondered what became of Hoffa, why he was killed, or who did it, or what happened to the body, you got to check out this excellent book by Charles Brandt, I Heard You Paint Houses. It was a #1 bestseller before. It's going to be made into a major motion picture. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it lays out the case of why it sure looks like Frank the Irishman Sheeran was right there at the scene, involved with the murder of Hoffa, and also knows about what happened to the body. We're going to get into specifics on that in just a moment here on Coast to Coast AM. As we just heard a couple of minutes ago, through a sort of a prophetic coincidence, Frank the Irishman Sheeran meets Russell Buffalino on the side of the road. Russell Buffalino is quite a figure in mafia circles. You know, Charlie, I remember after your book first came out, some other mob writers, you know, it's a fraternity of sorts, but it can be kind of nasty at times. They would write, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Russell Buffalino wasn't a major figure. He was the head of a small mafia family in Pennsylvania. He wasn't that much of a heavy hitter. To which you would say what?
Oh, it's silly. Russell was. Let me just back up and say that the FBI solved the whodunit part of Hoffa's disappearance within 2 months. Bob Garrity, who is now a dear friend of mine, was the case agent in charge, and Bob put a memo together called the Hoffex Memo.
Yeah.
All of these other writers are people who rely on Bob Garrity's Hoffex Memo, and in the Hoffex Memo, there are 9 suspects listed. Chief among them was Frank the Irishman Sheeran, and his boss, Russell Buffalino. And 8 of those 9 actually were involved. So that's silly. And as we sit here now, the FBI is in the possession of the final bit of corroboration that Sheeran was the killer of Jimmy Hoffa. But in any event, I met Bob Garrity. Let me just back up and say one thing about these other guys. They're writers. They're journalists. They're investigative journalists. And no offense to investigative journalists who have done major investigations. But this is really their only murder case. I solved murder cases for a living. I interrogated suspects. I solved crimes by interrogating suspects. And I had Frank Sheeran to myself for close to 5 years. I didn't just have him on a witness stand for an afternoon. So I could ask him about something today, and 2 years later, ask him about it again and see if he said it with the same energy and the same detail as he did the first time. So it's silly for anyone to quibble. But as far as what the FBI has, let me just fill the audience in. You mentioned that there's a new edition, and that's what I'm out there now doing, plugging this new edition. The new edition has 57 additional pages. These were things, as you mentioned, that I didn't want to tell before because there were mob figures that were still alive, and I didn't want to get on the wrong side of some of these figures. Chief among them was a guy named Billy D'Elia. Billy took over the Buffalino crime family when Russell died. Let me tell you first how powerful Russell Buffalino was. After I wrote I Heard You Paint Houses, I wrote a book with the real Donnie Brasco, Joe Pistone, a sequel to Donnie Brasco. It was called Donnie Brasco Unfinished Business, material that he didn't tell in the first book, not because of his fear of mob bosses, because he's fearless. He's a dear friend of mine.
I know. I got to meet him in connection with that book. Yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Oh, that's right. You did that book, Donnie Brasco Unfinished Business. But in any event, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, we're talking about Buffalino and his power, I think.
Buffalino. Joe introduced me to Al Martino, the singer who played Johnny Fontaine in the 3 Godfather movies. And Al told me how Russell Buffalino got him his job in The Godfather. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, wanted to use a real actor instead of a singer for the Johnny Fontaine part. They could dub in a voice, a singing voice. But Al wanted that part. So he went to his godfather, Russell, and his godfather, Russell, gave him that part. And I was giving a talk at the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and I told that anecdote about Al Martino, the late Al Martino. He died in October 2009 of a heart attack. But I told that story. A woman came up to me afterwards and introduced herself. She said her name was Wanda Ruddy, and that her husband was Al Ruddy, who was the producer of The Godfather. I'd never heard of Al Ruddy. I just go to the movies and associate that movie with Francis Ford Coppola. Anyway, she said to me that Al and I ought to have a talk about Russell. And she asked me, did you know that Russell had final script approval of the movie The Godfather? And, of course, I didn't know that, but I now know that. And that's in the new edition. You mentioned the new edition. It has 57 pages, as I said, that I couldn't put in before. As well, good mafia anecdotes and good lessons about how the mafia operates. But as well, there is corroboration in the 57 pages, because with each new edition of the book, along comes people who have something to say, as Wanda Ruddy had something to say to me. The three major unsolved crimes, unsolved murders of the 20th century was Jimmy Hoffa, Crazy Joey Gallo at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy in New York, and what happened to JFK. Well, Frank Sheeran was involved in all three, and all three have been corroborated. And the corroboration appears in the 57 pages.
We'll come back to JFK a little bit later. I want to, back to Buffalino. It just occurred to me that if you were really smart and you were a mafia guy, you'd want to keep a low profile as possible. So it doesn't hurt your feelings if somebody else looks like they're the big shot mafia boss that's pulling the strings. You'd prefer it that way.
Well, you'd prefer it that way. Now there was the ruling commission in place in New York City, the five families. Russell was not a member of the five families, but the five families never did anything of any consequence without running it by Russell, consulting him, and getting his planning and approval. And Russell planned the hit on Hoffa. Russell supplied Frank Sheeran as the hitman, as the only one that could get close enough to Hoffa in those troubled days, get close enough to him and get him alone to kill him. And that's, it's beyond question corroborated. Here's the way it was corroborated in the conclusion chapter. The replacement for Russell Buffalino when he died was his underboss and nephew, Billy D'Elia.
Right.
When I traveled with Frank Sheeran during those 5 years, I was kind of undercover in the sense that I was posing as a guy who was going to write a book restoring Frank Sheeran's name. There were 6 books about Hoffa's disappearance, and every one of them, relying on Bob Garrity's Hofex memo, gave a role of some kind to Frank Sheeran. And Frank was going to be cleared by my book. While he was out there saying that to these people, he and I were involved in our own interrogation process. And he was giving me serial confession after serial confession. Frank did 25 to 30 hits, so there was a lot of material there. And one day, I went to a birthday party for Frank, and Billy D'Elia was there. He had taken over the family. And of course, 8 guys named Rocco. And I left after the candles were blown out. I said to Frank, I've got to get back to my law office. I was still practicing law then. That night, Frank called me up and said, you know what that Billy said about me after you left? Said about you after you left? I said, no, Frank, what did Billy say about me? And, you don't want to hear that the mafia boss of the Buffalino family is saying anything about you. Frank said, Billy turned to me and he said, do I trust that guy? I said, do I trust that guy? If it wasn't for that guy, I'd still be in jail for 10 more years. I had gotten Frank out of jail. That's how I began this relationship with him, on medical grounds, early parole. And I said to Frank, wait a minute, what did the boss of the Buffalino family say about me? That's all I care about. Oh, F him. I never liked that mother effer, and he never liked me. I said, Frank, hold on now. You taught me. When in doubt, have no doubt. The boss of the Buffalino family has doubt about me. Ah, F him. I never liked that mother effer, and he never liked me. Oh, Frank, is this supposed to make me feel better? So there was the guy that didn't like me. I knew it. When you read the original edition of this book, there's no mention of Billy D'Elia in the book at all. Not even a little bit. No reference to him, not even by his nickname. And then there was a new edition that came out with an epilogue. I didn't mention Billy D'Elia again. Then one day, Billy gets arrested. He gets arrested for ordering hits on 2 government witnesses. He orders them to a guy that's already cooperating with the FBI and is wearing a wire. Now they got Billy for life sentence, ordering 2 hits. They make a deal with him. He becomes a cooperating witness. And the first question they asked him when they went to see him in jail was what happened to Hoffa. And he told them to read my book. And he said that he had given a copy of the book when it first came out to a guy named Frank Pavlico, one of his underlings. And he had inscribed the book, "Sometimes you can believe everything you read." Right after that happened, the FBI contacted me. Now, I'm not talking about Bob Garrity. Bob is long ago retired, and Bob and I are, as I mentioned, very close friends. This was a real agent, a new guy named Andy Sluss, and he called me up, and we had a great conversation. Now, they can't go public with this because they can't comment on this publicly, let me put it that way, because the FBI cannot publicly comment on an active case. And as long as Chucky O'Brien is still alive, one of the conspirators, and living in Boca Raton, Florida, and as long as Tommy Andretta is still alive and living in your hometown of Las Vegas, the FBI can't say anything other than, "Let me have your tapes, Charlie," which I gave them. So that's the Hoffa matter. The Crazy Joey Gallo hit at Umberto's Clam House. After my first edition came out, there's a photograph of Frank Sheeran in it. There was there is, I should say, a New York Times editor, a very respected woman. And the people at the Times knew from word of mouth that she had been at Umberto's when the hit went down. And so somebody, another journalist, showed her a copy of Frank Sheeran in the book I Heard You Paint Houses, and she said, "That gives me chills. That's the man that did the shooting." And then I contacted retired Detective Joe Coffey, whose case it was, NYPD detective, and he said absolutely. It was a lone gunman, even though all the books on the Crazy Joey Gallo hit. And there were two movies. Peter Boyle of Everybody Loves Raymond played Crazy Joey Gallo in one of the two movies. And all of them say that there were three Italians who burst into Umberto's and began firing away at Crazy Joey, who was there celebrating his 40th birthday. But Joe Coffey explained to me that he let that story of three gunmen remain out there as an integrity test, so that if an informant came forward and said, "I've got some information for you on those three gunmen," and was looking for a payday, Joe Coffey would dismiss the guy immediately, because Coffey knew it was not three gunmen, it was a lone gunman, and he knew that it was not an Italian man, it was a 6'4" Irishman. So, these cases are already solved in terms of corroboration.
Well, let's go back to Hoffa. So Buffalino gets to know Sheeran. Sheeran starts doing jobs for Buffalino, and then he's introduced to Jimmy Hoffa, becomes very close. Walk us through the steps of how do you say to Frank Sheeran, who adores and cares for Jimmy Hoffa, how do you say to a guy like that, "Listen, you're going to have to kill him. You're going to have to help us get rid of him"?
Let me back up a little bit. I'm going to answer that question, but I want to tell you about Sheeran's first hit for Buffalino to let you know how they do it. They began to give Sheeran little jobs. Go out to Jersey. A guy owes money. Pick up the money from him. If he doesn't have it, show him your gun. And they give him a gun. And you don't use the gun in those days. Sheeran said later on they began using the gun with the younger, wilder, cocaine-using mafia guys in the Philadelphia mob. But in the days that Frank was involved, this would be, say, 1957. Then one day, a guy named Whispers DiTullio proposes to Frank, and he was a hanger-on. He wasn't a made man or a mafia boss of any kind. That Frank torch a laundry, a professional laundry, in the Philadelphia area, because he had this Whispers DiTullio had lent money to a rival laundry, and the rival laundry was having trouble competing with this other laundry, and as a consequence, they weren't able to pay on a regular basis, pay this Whispers DiTullio. So Frank agreed for $10,000 to torch the the laundry. He went down to the laundry and began casing it. The next thing you know, he's called into a meeting with Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philly family, and Russell Buffalino, who was not merely the boss of upstate Pennsylvania. He was the boss of all of Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. He was also the boss of all of upstate New York, parts of New Jersey, and parts of New York City. He kept a hotel apartment at the Hotel Consulate in New York. And very powerful man. And they sat down with Frank, and they said, what were you doing casing the, I forget the Cadillac laundry supply service, linen supply service? And Sheeran said, well, Whispers to Tullio was going to pay me $10,000 to torch you. And Angelo said to him, do you know who owns a piece of that laundry? And Frank said, no, I don't. He said, I do. How come you didn't come to me and check? And then he pointed to Russell. And he said, no, because you're with Russell, I got to give you a chance. I got to give you one chance here. The people that run that laundry are part of the Jewish mafia. And they spotted you right away as somebody out of place who didn't belong there. And Whispers knows better. He should have checked with me. You should have checked with me. And now you got to take care of Whispers. So that became Frank's first hit, killing Whispers to Tullio. And it was either him or me. He saw the newspaper the next day of the whack on de Tullio, and his first thought was, that could have been me. And so you start out and you're conditioned by these mafia people to know that if you say no to them, you're dead. If you don't play by their rules completely, you're dead. And the way it went down with Frank and Hoffa and Russell had been an ally of Hoffa's. He had been a staunch supporter of Hoffa's. But Hoffa just cut wilder and crazier with his rhetoric, his campaign rhetoric. Sheeran said Hoffa was just puffing, but it just went the wrong way with Russell. And finally, Hoffa wouldn't accept Russell's order to simply stay home with your grandchildren and get out of this race. And once he said to Russell, actually he said to Sheeran even worse, but once he said no to Russell, he was doomed. And when Frank tried to tell him that he was doomed afterwards, Hoffa said they wouldn't dare. Well, Frank had to repeat that to Russell because, God forbid, they had the place wired, because they do that too. The mafia did that too in those days. They would wire something like Hoffa's hotel room. And excuse me. In fact, Hoffa went to trial once because he had bugged somebody's rivals in his union. He had hired a guy to bug their meeting place. So, you say no to Russell, and you're gone. Well, Sheeran did everything he could short of saying no. He tried to convince Hoffa to stop this crazy campaign to take back the Union. He tried to say things to Russell to kind of placate Russell and keep Hoffa alive. And finally, it seemed to be working. Russell agreed to allow a meeting between Hoffa's biggest rival in the mafia, a man named Tony Provenzano, in Detroit, a meeting set up by Tony Giacalone. And these are all people on Bob Garrity's Hoffa's memo.
Right. We're gonna stop it there because the music tells us we're going to a break. When we come back, the conclusion of that part of the story of the circumstances that led to Jimmy Hoffa's murder, and then what happened to the body. We're talking with Charles Brandt, author of I Heard You Paint Houses. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Kind of a rousing, jaunty tune from U2. It's there's so many good songs on that album, Joshua Tree. This one kind of gets overlooked. It's called Trip Through Your Wires. It's a pretty good one. So we have heard that Frank Sheeran is the guy who pulled the trigger, killed Jimmy Hoffa. And in a moment, Charles Brandt, author of the book I Heard You Paint Houses, is going to walk us through Jimmy Hoffa's final hours, where the murder took place, what became of the body. And also in this hour, we're going to hear about what, if any, role Frank Sheeran played in the death of John F. Kennedy. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. So continuing our conversation with Charles Brandt, Charlie, Frank Sheeran is Hoffa's good friend. He has the conversation, delivers the message from Mafia boss Russell Bufalino, hey, back off, stop this stuff trying to reclaim the head of the Teamsters Union, go spend some time with your grandkids and live a long, happy life. And Hoffa defies Russell Bufalino. Frank Sheeran has to deliver that news to Bufalino. Did you ever ask him, I mean, did he know at that point that it was going to be him that would have to take care of it?
No, he didn't know.
Seems like a logical thing.
Well, the reason is he thought that he had made progress in his campaign to save Hoffa. They had agreed to a meeting in Detroit between Tony Provenzano and Jimmy Hoffa to square this beef that the mob had against Hoffa, and that would allow Hoffa to continue to run. And Sheeran agreed to accompany Hoffa to this meeting. It was going to be at the Marcus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomington Township outside of Detroit. And Hoffa knew that Sheeran was going to be in Detroit because Russell's nephew, William Bufalino, who was the Teamsters counsel, his daughter was getting married. So mobsters were coming in from all over the country to attend Bill Bufalino's daughter's wedding. And so he knew that Tony Pro would be there. So this was a perfect opportunity to have this meeting. Hoffa arrived at the Marcus Red Fox restaurant, but there was no Frank Sheeran. And the reason there was no Frank Sheeran is that the night before, the plans had changed. And up until the changing of those plans, Frank really believed that he had helped Jimmy square his beef with the Mafia, and that once Tony Pro was satisfied that in the meeting with Hoffa, that Hoffa could then be left alone and wouldn't be killed. But the night before, Russell at dinner told Sheeran, who was going to be driving their wives and Russell to the wedding in Detroit. It's all the same time zone, Philadelphia and Detroit. And Sheeran was told by Russell that there was a change of plans. It's too late. Higher ups than me have decided that it's too late for your friend. You let it go too far. Now, the new plan was that Sheeran and Bufalino would drive to Fort Clinton, Ohio, and there was a small airstrip there, that they would leave the women who smoked cigarettes in a diner, let them smoke their cigarettes and have their coffee. And Sheeran would board a plane. Russell owned a big chunk of Medico Industries, which was the largest supplier of ammunition to the federal government, bullets, dynamite, and he had the Medico plane at his disposal at all times. So Sheeran boarded the plane. The plane flew over Lake Erie to Pontiac, Michigan, north of Detroit. There was a car waiting there for Sheeran. He got in the car, and there was a little note with an address. He read the address. He knew Detroit very well. He worked there. He threw it away. He went to the house, and there's a picture of the house in the book. And that's at that house. He and a guy named Sal Bergoglio and the Andretta brothers, Steve and Tommy, were in the house when Chucky O'Brien pulled up. Sal and Sheeran got in the car. Chucky went back to the Marcus Red Fox parking lot where Hoffa was still waiting. Hoffa had just called his wife to say, have you heard anything from Frank? And Frank was, he was well known to be really a member of the Hoffa family. Frank had said, "I'll be a Hoffa man till they pat my face with a shovel and steal my cufflinks." And so the car pulls up to Jimmy, who is walking across the parking lot. And Jimmy's irate. "What are you doing here, Chucky? What's going on here? And who is this guy?" Meaning Sal Bergoglio. And then Sheeran, who was a giant, he had to bend down, peeked across Chucky O'Brien to reassure Jimmy. And Frank said that Russell decided he wanted to be at the meeting himself. And Jimmy knew that Russell would not be at a meeting in a restaurant. And so we've got a private house to have this meeting. And Jimmy believed that with Russell being there, it was even better for him. So Chucky drove, Hoffa got in the car, and Chucky then drove the car to this house in Detroit. And in the back room, in the kitchen with the door closed, were the Andretta brothers. They were the cleaners to get rid of the body and get rid of any blood. And they were the only ones in the house. Russell, of course, wasn't there. And when they got there, Sal Bergoglio stayed in Chucky O'Brien's car, the car Chucky was driving, which was Tony Giacalone's son's car. And he was driven away. Frank Sheeran's car was still there, the one he picked up at the airport in Pontiac. And they walk in together. Hoffa always got out in front of everyone when he walked. He walked up the steps into the house with Sheeran behind him. Sheeran closed the door. Hoffa could see at once that it was set up because there was nobody there. At a meeting with Russell, there'd be the clink of wine glasses, there'd be food everywhere, and there was nothing. So Hoffa realized what was going on, made a U-turn, and started to head out the door, grabbed for the doorknob, and Sheeran put two bullets into the back of his head. So that's how Hoffa died. Now, the Andretta brothers then had the body cremated through the help of Bagnasco's funeral parlor in Detroit.
Which is just a couple of minutes away, right?
Yeah. Everything was all a few minutes away. And the whole thing from beginning to end took an hour.
So over the years, as you are working with Sheeran, putting this story together and pulling details out of him as you work his Catholic guilt and he tells you new bits and pieces, there are stories that surface. Jimmy Hoffa is buried in Giant Stadium. Jimmy Hoffa's body was put into a drum and dropped in a swamp. Jimmy Hoffa went on the run and lives in Brazil. It's almost humorous. It's not humorous.
Frank would literally laugh at them. You say it's humorous, Frank would laugh at them. And Frank said if there was a body to find, the FBI would have found it a long time ago. The first dent in Frank's armor as far as the Hoffa, the hit, were the following words: "People don't think the FBI knows what the F they're doing. The FBI knows what the F they're doing." They had focused on those suspects that were in the Hoffa X memo, and they went after them the way they went after Al Capone for tax evasion, or whatever they could get him on. And they got Frank for labor racketeering and gave him 32 years in jail when the average labor racketeer might have gotten 5. But they just put pressure on all of them. They put Tony Provenzano away for life for an old murder, for a decade-old murder that they worked. They pulled it out of the closed case file and worked it and got him on it. And they put Tony Giacalone away for 20 years for, again, a tax thief. And they just went after them. They got both Andretta brothers for some union stuff that they were doing. So they knew who had done it. They just didn't know who had done what. And
now
then,
you know the FBI people who worked this case have now said your version is what we believe to be true. I mean, it's beyond that. They say it is true, but
not to the public yet.
Right?
Because it's still an active case. But anybody who reads the book, it has the ring of truth. You read it, and the edition you read was an old edition. the new one has way more corroboration than the one you read.
No, I've got the new one. I've got I've got something that says conclusion, new back matter for I Heard You Paint Houses. Yeah, I've got it. July 2016.
Good.
So you're working with Sheeran, putting together this book. Buffalino and the other mob guys know you're working with him. Ostensibly, you're going to write a book that whitewashes it. In essence, tells Sheeran's story, paints him as a good guy. He had nothing to do with this stuff. But you and he were actually collaborating on something much different. If he had lived, what would have happened to him if the book comes out?
Well, good question. We would meet regularly with his lawyer. His criminal lawyer was the former district attorney of Philadelphia, F.M. Fitzpatrick. And I would bring him out of a sense of obligation, bring him to Emmett every so often. And in the last meeting with Emmett said to him, you will be indicted. With your health, bad health, I can keep you out of jail. Keep you in a nursing home or keep you somewhere with an ankle bracelet. But you will be indicted. Now, what Sheeran had in mind, I wasn't aware of. So we then had the final taping. All my tapes were on audio tape, but the final one was going to be on videotape with Frank standing behind all the material he had given me in audio tape. And after that, he wanted to say the Hail Mary and Our Father, 2 Catholic prayers. Then he wanted the Catholic priest in the hospital to give him absolution and receive Holy Communion from the priest. And then he killed himself. He stopped eating. And that is apparently I didn't realize this, what is done in nursing homes when the elderly want to die, they just stop eating. And Frank just stopped eating. He wasn't difficult. My wife and I would go up and try to coax him into it, and he adored my wife, but he wouldn't eat a thing. He would drink, and he ate a little bit of Italian ice for my wife, and was gone within 6 weeks.
And what was the timing in terms of when he died and when the book came out? It must have been pretty close.
Oh yeah, the book came out. He died December of 2003, and the book came out in May of 2004.
Yeah, it would have been pretty rough for him, not just the legal consequences, but maybe other consequences had he lived and his former colleagues knew what he was doing.
Well, that could be. He never said that, and I never thought of that. But he was so tough and so respected by these people, and he made us feel safe, especially my wife. The book coming out, it was coming out on a Monday, the Memorial Day weekend. That Friday, there was a lot of publicity, particularly Eric Shawn on Fox News, who, by the way, added corroboration by having the house tested for old blood with the use of luminol, and there was a trail of blood exactly where it should be if they carried the body out and into a car and off to Bagnasco's for cremation. The cremation wasn't done in Bagnasco's because they don't do cremations in funeral parlors in Michigan. But Bagnasco's took it to the Evergreen Cemetery where the cremation occurred. But anyway, my wife got an email from a former paralegal of mine who had dated a friend of Billy's by the name of Brent. And Brent closed the email with, P.S., Billy is not happy with Charlie. And Diane sent it to my wife, knowing that I'm a little half nuts, and it wouldn't have bothered me so much. And my wife was bothered by it. And I said, honey, and Billy hasn't seen the book yet. It doesn't land in the stores until Monday. It doesn't be released on Monday. It was embargoed. And when he reads it, he's going to see that his name isn't mentioned at all. And, of course, he did see that, and that's when he inscribed the book to Frank Pavlico. Sometimes you can't believe everything you read.
Let's talk about JFK for a couple of minutes. We have a break coming up in about 4 or 5 minutes. You approached this subject. There was a line that must have stopped you dead in your tracks that Frank Sheeran said to you, I won't go near Dallas, meaning I don't want to talk about what happened to JFK And that must have really piqued your curiosity. So how did you get him to open up about that?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. This is in the new edition. In the first edition, I talked about how we began our 5 years of collaborating on Serial Confessions. But I mentioned that there had been an earlier start 8 years earlier, and Frank did not like the interrogative nature of that initial interrogation session that we had 8 years before we actually began in earnest. Well, what he didn't like was what happened in that first session 8 years earlier. One of the techniques, well, there are a number of them, but two that I favored with Frank was to put the blame on Hoffa for his own death, and that would ease Frank's conscience. I would say things like, he was asking for it, Frank. He kept being warned. You tried to warn him. Shit, I'd have killed him myself, Frank. I mean, you can't go around like Hoffa was going around. That was one technique. Another technique is when you have a guy talking, you keep him talking. You ask him what color dress did his sister wear to her high school prom. You keep him talking about anything. Well, toward the end of our first standalone session, 8.5 years before we began in earnest, I had him talking about the Hoffa murder. And I had him, this was 5 hours worth of talking. I had 80% of what happened to Hoffa. And to keep him talking, I asked him why there were so many people involved. The Andretta brothers, Sal Bagulio, Chuck O'Brien, Tony Chocolone, Tony Pro, you, Russell, why so many people? And Frank said, well, that way, if you go bad, you only know what you did, and you don't know what the ones before you did and the ones after you did. I said, but that makes sense, Frank. And I remembered a film noir movie I had seen called Blast of Silence, where a hitman is flown to New York from Cleveland, does the hit, goes to collect his money for the hit, and he's whacked. And I said to Frank, I got to think that if you take a hit like that on your own, you're going to be killed after the hit. And Frank said, you'd have to be out of your mind to do something like this by yourself. They're not going to have he used to call them the people, meaning the mob. The people are not going to have a massacre. But a lone cowboy does something like this on his own. He's going to be disposed of. He's disposable. And I very innocently said, because at that time I had not read a single book on Dallas. I was a junior high teacher in Queens when the assassination occurred, and everything I was hearing in the news was kind of a turnoff to me. I just didn't want to waste my time reading about something that nobody was making any sense when I heard them on TV talk about. In any event, I said to Sheeran, like that lone cowboy Lee Harvey Oswald. And Sheeran turned to stone. I knew something was up. And I said, he was disposable and he was disposed of by Jack Ruby. And he just looked frightened and crazed at the same time. And I said, Ruby's job obviously was to kill Oswald on the street. And when that failed, he had to go into that police station and kill him. Ruby had cops on his, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Frank Sheeran says to me, and he waves me off with his right hand, I'm not going anywhere near Dallas.
All right, we're going to stop there. Charles Brandt, when we come back, we're going to open up the phone lines for questions, a couple of questions from our guests. I'll let you finish talking about Frank Sheeran's role in JFK and knowledge of the assassination. This is going to get good here. Stick around, folks. In the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, a newly expanded and updated version of the book by Charles Brandt, Frank the Irishman Sheeran admits he killed Jimmy Hoffa, pumped 2 bullets into the back of his head, his friend Jimmy Hoffa. He admits to 25 up to 30 other murders that he's committed under the orders of Hoffa and other mafia guys. But when the subject is raised about what, if any, role he played in Dallas, the JFK assassination, he clams up. It's like talking to a wall of stone. At first, anyway. Later, he tells more, and we're going to get into that in a moment. It's no wonder that this book has been optioned as a major motion picture. And when you hear about some of the people involved, I mean, Martin Scorsese will direct. Robert De Niro will play the role of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, and some other big names are in that as well. We'll get to that sometime in the next half hour and get to a couple of your questions as well from my guest, Charles Brandt. Stick around. Charles Brandt, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, when you first got into the topic of JFK and Dallas, Frank Sheeran didn't want to talk about it. He clammed up. It took you years to get him to open up about it, but there are two quotes that are absolutely chilling in the new version of the book, the updated version. Russell Buffalino tells Jimmy Hoffa, "There are people higher up than me who feel you are demonstrating a failure to show appreciation," and then in hushed tones, "for Dallas." Failure to show appreciation for Dallas. Then later, Buffalino tells Frank Sheeran, if they could take out the president, they could take out the president of the Teamsters. That sure sounds like the mob had something to do with JFK.
Well, yeah. And then that was in the book from the beginning. It's been in all editions. But in the new edition, we have something new. A man named David Kaiser, a naval historian, wrote a book about Dallas called The Road to Dallas. And more recently, it came out in 2008. I didn't read it in 2008. My book came out in 2004. But when I read it in connection with the chapter, the new chapter, the 57 pages of the new edition, on page 411 of that book, David Kaiser, 411, same number of combat days Frank had, David Kaiser talks about FBI reports that were released to the public pursuant to a statute that slowly releases JFK documents. And these recently released documents corroborate what Frank Sheeran told me about his role and Russell's role and Hoffa's role. And it's corroboration I never dreamed I would ever have. It's just a single paragraph. David Kaiser doesn't really know what to make of it because he doesn't know what Frank Sheeran told. Frank Sheeran told me that Russell had sent him to Monty's Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, and there he picked up 3 rifles in a duffel bag from the same Tony Provenzano, who was later to be instrumental in Hoffa's death. This was 1963, and Sheeran picked up the rifles, delivered them to an airstrip in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore. Sheeran didn't know what they were for. Sheeran was never told in 1963 what they were for. But when Sheeran saw Jack Ruby kill Oswald, Sheeran was convinced that somehow the mafia was involved and that perhaps those rifles that he brought down there to Baltimore were involved. But again, as he said to me, I don't have to tell you, there was nobody you could ask about something like that. That was 63. In 1974 are those quotes that you just mentioned, that Frank Sheeran was the night before something called Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night. The mob put together an appreciation for Frank Sheeran at the Latin Casino. Jerry Vale, the singer, who Martin Scorsese has used on 9 movies. Jerry Vale was the entertainment. And those quotes that you read were from the night before, from an argument between Russell and Hoffa, where Russell said, there are higher-ups than me that feel you're not showing appreciation for Dallas. And he said to Sheeran, as Sheeran was taking Hoffa back to the Hotel Warwick in Philly, you're dreaming, my friend. If they could take out the president, they could take out the president of the Teamsters. They were dreaming, meaning Frank was trying to talk Russell out of hurting Hoffa. So anyway, what I have in my book is evidence. What you see in other books is speculation. I was a jury trial lawyer when I left the Attorney General's office as chief deputy. I had 4 men on death row. My life was threatened by the black Muslims. I had a ton of experiences that I brought to bear on this work. And I certainly for a $20,000 advance that I got for this book, I certainly didn't need to ruin my reputation as the top trial lawyer in Delaware, a lawyer that had his cases referred to him by judges. I didn't advertise, and I didn't need to publish a book where I would be made a fool of. But instead of being made a fool of, I got corroboration out of nowhere on Hoffa, on Crazy Joey Gallo, on Dallas. In fact, the editor of the New York Times gave her testimony on a PBS television show where they hid her face, and she I positively identified Sheeran as the killer of Crazy Joey Gallo.
So do you suppose the mob didn't do it entirely as a favor to Hoffa? JFK, the Kennedys were battling with the Teamsters. RFK went after.
They didn't really do it at all as a favor to Hoffa, but they got Hoffa to ask for it to be done, and to let him believe that they did it for him. But you're right. They had so many motives to kill JFK. It isn't funny.
Let's take a couple of calls. First-time caller, Brian in Orlando. Hi, Brian. You're on with Charlie Brandt. Brian, hello.
Yes, hello. Before I get to my question, I feel that the Kennedy family had over 100 members of their immediate family threatening to become a de facto monarchy on American soil. Therefore, they had to go. I feel that the mafia cleaned up some loose ends, but that they were not responsible for these.
What? What did you say? The Kennedys had to go? What are you saying?
You want me to They were threatening to become a de facto monarchy on American soil, and that's what we ran away from the British.
Okay, thanks for the call, Brian. I'm not even going to get into that. We're going to go west of the Rockies. Mark in Modesto. Hi, Mark. Mark in Modesto, are you there? All right, we're going to leave Mark. We're going to go east of the Rockies. Jeff, or whoever is on the east of the Rockies line. How about that?
Hi, this is Sean.
Hi, Sean. How you doing? What's on your mind?
Good. I'm actually a Teamster myself, and I'm a huge fan of your show, I must say. And Charles, I'm a huge fan of your book. I texted my best friend Vinny in Columbus. We're both big fans. More importantly, we're huge Scorsese fans, De Niro fans. We've been waiting for this collaboration to happen. It seems like for almost 6-7 years. And I don't know if you heard anything. I mean, we've been waiting, to hear about Joe Pesci. He says he wants to be involved or doesn't want to be involved. But then we heard the studios want him to be involved and that this deal is pending on his involvement. So I was wondering if maybe you had heard anything about this situation or anything like that.
Well, the new edition that has the yellow sunburst on it, soon to be a major motion picture directed by Martin Scorsese. We couldn't put that on there without Scorsese's approval. And there are plenty of other things out there citing that Joe Pesci's involvement. And he's been cited as being involved by De Niro on the Charlie Rose show, on lots of shows over the course of these past few years. And I can't imagine, and I know that he was slated to play Russell Buffalino. Al Pacino is positively on board, and he's slated to play Jimmy Hoffa. So it's going to be an amazing cast. The screenwriter, Steve Zalian, won the Oscar for Schindler's List, and boy, is he sharp. So this is going to be quite a movie.
It's been up and down, Charlie. You and I have been in touch over the last few years, and it's on, it's off, or it's on though now. Or will you have an active role in it?
Well, I did already, in a sense of I had a meeting with Scorsese, De Niro, and Steve Zalian to give them material that was not in the original edition of the book. It was supposed to last an hour. It lasted 4 hours. And I'll tell you an anecdote. They wanted to know about me personally. We all grew up Italian in New York, three of us. Zalian is Armenian from Fresno. But we had a lot of fun. It went from supposedly an hour meeting to a 4-hour meeting. And during that time, I had been born in Staten Island. Scorsese said, I lived in Staten Island as a boy, but I had asthma and I was forced to move. And we lived in a small town called Neudorf. And I had to move back to Little Italy because Neudorf, Staten Island was kind of damp and foggy. But my parents loved New York so much that, as staunch Catholics as they were, they insisted that they be buried in the Protestant cemetery in New York, the Moravian Cemetery. And I could never figure that out. And I said to him, well, let me explain it to you. I said, when my people came over, they landed in Brooklyn. And when they left Brooklyn to own land, because they couldn't own land in Italy, they moved to New York, Staten Island themselves. And my grandparents and many members of my family are buried in that Moravian cemetery too. And the reason for that is when the Italians invaded New York, Father Barletta at the Moravian cemetery spoke fluent Italian, but the Irish priest at Our Lady Queen of Peace didn't speak any Italian at all. And so they all gravitated toward Father Barletta. Well, Scorsese slapped his thigh and said, oh my God, you solved the family mystery for me. And all I knew was at that moment, they're making this movie. You don't get a God shot like that, And since then, there were some ups and downs, but we know what they were. We know why they happened. But the main down happened as a result of that 4-hour meeting. I gave them so much material that they had to rewrite the screenplay. They were sitting there with a screenplay in hand, and they had to rewrite it. De Niro's partner, Jane Rosenthal, called me after I got home, and they wanted me to sign a release on the new material, which I was happy to do, and that I'd given them. And so we got bumped out of line, and once you're out of line, it's hard to get back in. And then Scorsese had a contractual obligation to make a movie that's going to be released this Christmas called Silence, a religious movie about missionaries in Japan in the year around 60.
Well, good. I mean, it's a great cast. It's a great director. I can't wait to see this thing. We're going to try to get one or two more calls in. Dave in Charlotte, North Carolina, on the wild card line. Hi, Dave.
Big fan of yours. Always try to listen with you on, Mr. Brandt. I loved your book. I'm a truck driver and a Teamster, and I've harangued my other truck driver and Teamster friends to read this book that needed to read it, and I've loaned several copies out to people. Now I'm going to have to find another copy. The question I wanted to ask you is, Jimmy Hoffa was always, being a Teamster, I'm just a big fan of his. Growing up, he was a working class hero, and I knew there were bad things about him. But what disturbed me in the book was apparently Frank worked as a hitman for Jimmy Hoffa. And number one, I'd like to know, who are these people Jimmy Hoffa had him hit? Were they like other unions trying to poach on his territory, which, not very nice? Or were they, people trying to infiltrate the Teamsters? Or has anybody tried to compile a list of these other people? Because I remember reading in your book that Frank once said he had to do 3 hits in one day, 1 in Chicago and 2 in Puerto Rico. And then he had to meet Jimmy in San Francisco in that evening. So can you shed any light on that, about these other killings?
I can. There were rival unions in Chicago. It was during a taxi cab drive to sign up the taxi cab drivers into the Teamsters Union, and the guy in charge was a Al Capone hitman and mafia figure, Joey Glimko, and Glimko had enemies, and Glimko went to Hoffa. I need these guys taken care of, and Hoffa sent Sheeran. In Puerto Rico, Hoffa had a very loyal, Chavez was his name, a very loyal Teamster leader in Puerto Rico, but he was a little trigger happy. And this is the guy that sent a telegram to Bobby Kennedy the day JFK was shot, saying that he intends to put a monument to Lee Harvey Oswald in Puerto Rico.
Oh boy,
he was quite a guy, and so he had enemies, again rivals. In answer to your question, I also want to tell you, as a truck driver, there's an audio book available through Amazon. You might listen to it while you're driving.
Okay, I'll be getting
the new edition, which has the additional material, is on audiobook with the same burst on it that it's a motion picture of Scorsese's.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Charlie, I saw an article recently of it was featured an interview with Frank Sheeran's daughter. That's kind of an interesting story that, she had sort of an inkling at some point that maybe it was an odd coincidence that her dad was in Michigan at the same time that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. But she never pushed it further and never realized until she read your book about her father what he did.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually in contact with one of, he had 4 daughters, and they're all alive. One he was estranged from at the time of his death. But I'm in touch with one of the 3 remaining daughters. Her name is Dolores, and we trade emails. She and I are both dog lovers, and so we get doggy emails from each other. And her younger sister Connie refuses to read the book to this day. And Connie said to Sheeran, to Dolores, please just tell me that Daddy didn't kill Frank Sindone. I always liked Frank Sindone. Well, Frank Sindone is one of those who participated in the killing of the Philly boss Angelo Bruno. And when he was killed, they stuffed $100 bills in his mouth to signify greed. And Dolores said to Connie, no, Connie, Daddy didn't kill Frank Sindone. And when Dolores told me that story, I said, no, wait a minute. I never asked him if he killed Sindone. We don't know. So we laugh a little bit about these things, even though they're kind of gruesome. But
I can imagine it must have been tough for 4 daughters. Yeah.
Those girls had a rough life. They were raised Catholic. Their mother was a dreamboat of a person, and good, honorable people. And Sheeran, part of his remorse toward the end of his life, the deathbed conversion that he had, part of his remorse was the effect that his notoriety in the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Philadelphia Daily News had on the lives of these girls growing up, going to Catholic school and seeing their father's name a suspect in this murder or that.
I think in a sense that confessing this stuff to you is a sense of seeking atonement.
Well, he did. He sought atonement. There's no question. And I have to say that when I first represented him to get him out of jail, I didn't like him. We had words at the prison, and I had to straighten him out. It's in the conclusion chapter. But as time went on, as I got to know him, and I felt the remorse that he felt, and little things. For example, he said,
we're going to be going to we're about to come to the end of the show here, Charles. Charles Brandt, the book was good to begin with. It's great to have an updated version, new stuff. I heard you paint houses. I hope people will check it out, and we'll all be looking for the movie when it comes out. Thanks for coming back and joining us, and I hope you'll stay in touch.
You bet.
Thanks, Charlie. All right. Thank you. And then up next,